here's the news flash. Investors care about their distributions. They care about the bottom line. And we know that it's not like we're in nonprofit business. This is very much for profit. I mean, Whitney, your approach in terms of your own personal generosity, I think is hugely important to our business model as a whole in drawing just that, type of avatar investor who is values driven. So that makes my job very fun.
One of the ways that we scaled quickly was attending many conferences early on and networking and learning as fast as possible. There's a conference coming up that you need to know about. It's called the Think Multifamily Annual Fire Summit Conference, and it's November 11th and 12th. You can save $100 on this conference by using promo code Whitney100. And if you're tired of paying too much in taxes or want to recession-proof your investment portfolio, you need to consider Think Multifamily's Annual Fire Summit, November 11th and 12th. The Think Multifamily team has over 25 years of experience, done over 100 apartment syndications, 16,000 units purchased in 13 states, and over $1 billion in assets under management. They have the experience that you can trust to help you grow your personal portfolio and avoid those pitfalls that often investors and syndicators fall into. They know you don't have to sacrifice integrity and transparency and servant leadership or your family values, and you're going to feel those things at this event when you attend. Don't forget, thinkmultifamily.com/fire and use promo code Whitney100 to save $100. This is your daily real estate syndication show. I'm your host, Whitney Sewell. Our guest today is part of the Life Bridge Capital team. I'm honored to bring you Deana Berg. Man, we're going to dive into what happens kind of over in the investor relations specialist office and some questions that we're getting asked by investors and a little bit about Deana and how she grew up in a real estate family. Her father was in commercial real estate, and it challenged me, even her sharing some things that her father did with her at a young age as they would have closings and whatnot. I thought, I want to think through how I can do some of those things with my children as well. But, Deana also worked in the nonprofit sector. She actually helped enable rural farmers in Central America to own their own land. And she worked with donors and lots of people in that space. And so she's somebody that loves just giving. She's a very generous person. She's a connector. She loves networking. She is very talented at that. And she's going to share some of those tips with you today. But even how in-house, how LifeBridge is growing our investor base, but even bigger than that, how we're deepening the relationship with some investors that we have already, right? That's something that's often missed in our space, that we're so focused on getting people in the door, but we don't think about enough of how we're nurturing them or how we're caring for those investors who have already committed to us, right? They've already shown their commitment to investing with your business potentially, and then they're just kind of forgotten about sometimes, and because you're so focused on getting the new ones in the door. So I want you to think about that as you're listening to Deana and I. But also, Deana has general partnership experience. She has limited partnership experience. She's a licensed, she has a brokerage license in Colorado as well. So she's very experienced in real estate, and I know you are going to learn a lot from her today. Honored to have a team member on the show today, and a newer team member at that, but is doing an amazing job. I know many of you listening are trying to do the same thing that she is doing. You're learning these same things, and I know she can help many of you, is going to help many of you. Deana, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Whitney. Glad to be here.
Yeah, honored to have you on the show. Deana was gladly hired recently as our investor relations specialist, and she is blowing that up in a good way. So Deana, grateful to have you. I want to tell the listeners, Deana's going to start hosting a few shows in the very near future, I hope, and honored to have her do that as well. And so as we strive to add more value to the listeners, but I want to dive into a little bit about who Deana is. I think this would be a great intro to even investors potentially that she's talking to on a day-to-day basis, but also dive into some things she's learning. She's talking to lots of investors. And I know you listening as a passive investor or active, you're going to want to hear some of these things that other investors are asking or things that they're sharing. So Deana, welcome again. Let's dive into who are you, Deana? What's a little bit of your background? How did you get to real estate syndication?
Thanks, Whitney. Well, I often tell the story. I grew up in a real estate home. My dad was a commercial developer up in Seattle, Washington. And I love thinking about Sundays after church, we would drive strip malls. We would drive by and look at what strip malls were on the market and what they might have to offer. And as a little kid, it's just not the way you want to spend your Sunday. But looking back now, I realize, man, I take my kids and they're like, oh, Mom, are we looking at more property? Why are we rolling by that apartment building? I'm just curious. I'm just checking it all out. I want to see what it looks like. But I'm thankful for those times because my dad was a very creative thinker. There wasn't a name for it back then, like syndication, but now I realize that's exactly what he was doing. And he did every asset class except multifamily. He did office buildings, office parks, retail strips, warehouse, you name it. And I can remember we would get new dresses whenever he would have a grand opening and we would hand out things at the door. Or I remember going to the grand opening of restaurants where you could order anything off of the menu that you wanted. And there was no charge because they were just practicing. So when I look back in my mind, these are some of the associations that I have with commercial real estate. So I really believe that was in my blood. And I worked in his office all growing up, even from junior high. I can remember sorting or going in on a Saturday, playing with a copy machine. And there were always treats at the office. But then in high school, I went and I became more part of the professional team. And then into college, my dad just wanted to hand things to me. And actually, at that point, I felt called and pulled in another direction. And so actually, the first part of my career, I was in the nonprofit sector. I worked in Latin America. I did international development work. When we think of development work here, we think of building businesses. Well, that's not what that is in Central America. It's developing areas. The rural poor is what I did. I helped people to own their own land through a 5-year development process. So we would do economic development, education, just, helping to encourage the growth of social structures in villages. And then after that, I went on and co-founded a nonprofit, and we passed over 20 anti-human trafficking laws in Washington state. So, and then I entered into the phase of life where we started having babies, and as ambitious and as purpose-driven as I was, I kind of came into the sober realization that I was fully replaceable in any of those roles. But that as the mom of my kids, I was the one and only. So I had a real conviction that I was to lay all of that down for a season while my kids were young and were at home and just go hard after being my own kid's parent. So, and I really felt like until my youngest was in the first grade that I needed to be home full time and just, I'm always doing stuff in the background, always have projects, always involved in things. So it wasn't like I was totally offline, but began to feel momentum, began to feel desire to learn more about commercial real estate, kind of broke the inertia from transitioning to the very fluid life of a mom to getting my real estate license and just applying myself in study and just kind of being around those thought processes. And then it was just a couple of years of voracious consumption of podcasts, of reading. Then I started attending conferences and I started meeting people. And I really started to feel like, man, how am I going to get into this area? I don't know what I can offer because my background is so different, yet it's in my blood. That's all I can say. And as I began building relationships, it began to become more and more clear that I am gifted in building relationships and that people feel comfortable around me, and that if you can ask good questions, you can build relationships. If you can listen actively, you can build relationships. And incidentally, that builds trust. And before you know it, people are reaching out and saying, hey, would you like to be involved in this? Or, so that's the long story of my pathway of how I came here. And honestly, this, Whitney, I'm just passionate about people. I love people. I love their idiosyncrasies. I love how different they are from one another. And I love what drives them. So.
Yes, I've seen it firsthand. Deana's very talented at hosting events and just caring for people in their home as well. It's been incredible to see her and her husband and her kids all involved in hosting events. And I've been a part of one of those. And so it's just neat to see that skill level. I think that can be burdensome to some people, right? Or it can be intimidating to have to host an event like that. But you all do it so well. And we may talk about that again in a minute, but I wanted to jump back to something you mentioned. You said when your father would have a grand opening that you would get a new dress. And, I just thought about that and I thought, how do I involve my kids in a way like when we close a deal? I've not done it, early on, right? It's such a big deal, right? Especially that first deal or two, a large deal, but I don't do as good a job at that now. And that made me think about that. Is there any other ways that maybe your father involved you or that stood out? Or how old were you then? I mean, that you still remember that? Were you really little? Were you a teenager? What did that look like?
Yeah, I was in elementary school. I mean, maybe fourth grade. I can remember standing at an office building handing out like roses to the women who came in, and I don't know what else we were handing out, but yeah, I remember that. And I remember he hired us to do it. So I got paid to get a new dress
That's even better.
and to hand out things. So he was involving me in a way that was interesting to me at that level. He was always taking, my dad. So the full story is that he passed away 20 years ago. So he's not here to share in the joy and to champion the work that I'm doing now. But he always had a backdoor entrance into every event, every deal. I don't know how he did it, but he would negotiate the deal, walk away with the pie, and everyone would be hugging and kissing him. He was just this kind of guy who everybody loved. He'd always end up getting upgraded into first class. And I don't even know, he would just talk to people and make them feel seen and loved. And I think that was his real gift. So as a child, I observed this. We'd walk into a restaurant and the hostesses would come and throw their arms around me. Oh, Ron, it's so great to see you. He'd know their names. He would look them in the eye and just treat them like a human.
I love that. You said, he would talk to people, he would make them feel heard, loved. I think you inherited a lot of that for sure. And let's jump into some of that as well. So I think we can learn a lot from your father, I think in real estate, I'm sure, but man, just in how he involved you, even in hiring you, giving you a dress, made it a big deal, right, for you as well, that you obviously have remembered, since even being a little girl. It does make me think about, man, am I doing those things that my kids are going to remember, in a good way, involving them. But let's jump forward a little bit and you're taking a bunch of investor calls. You are talking to lots of investors. And what are some things that you're learning? What are some maybe questions that investors are having that you see more common lately? And maybe how you're answering those questions. Let's jump into some of that.
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the questions that I receive all of the time is just about the transition that we're experiencing from going to external property management to vertical integration. And how is that going to affect the information that you can provide me as an investor? So bottom line, here's the news flash. Investors care about their distributions. They care about the bottom line. And we know that. It's not like we're in nonprofit business. This is very much for profit. I mean, Whitney, your approach in terms of your own personal generosity, I think is hugely important to our business model as a whole in drawing just that, type of avatar investor who is values driven. So that makes my job very fun. I mean, I talk to people all the time who are wonderful people, but they want to know, how is what's happening on site going to affect my distributions? And so I think that's something that company-wide that we're continually striving to improve. But I love taking feedback from investors. And I want you all to know, if you're listening as an investor, that I take notes on all of our calls and that I post it to our team. And I say, hey, here's a way that we can improve. Let's address this. So we meet and we talk regularly, and we're working all of that out. A lot of you as investors are like, I just want my cash flow to be very steady, and I might not be as interested in a big equity check at the end of the deal because maybe you're retired, or maybe you're just looking to replace your income and you don't want the W-2 anymore. And what's important to you is reliable and dependable cash flow. I'm surprised actually to hear how many of you that is a very big priority, not getting the cash flow and a regularity, but just that you would rather have cash flow than equity. You have your equity investors, no doubt. So it informs the way that we build deals and that we model things out to provide what our investors are asking for.
Yeah, love that. No doubt. The bottom line, investors care about their distribution. We have received a ton of questions around third-party management and how that's going to affect things. And I think, or let me ask you, have they been excited about that? Has that been a good thing that we're bringing that in-house? What's been the honest overall opinion of investors as you share why we're bringing management in-house?
Yes, I actually think it is a huge competitive advantage for us as a company. I mean, one thing that we're learning in this whole process of transitioning from property management is that there's all matter of property managers, and as Sutton Turner, our asset manager, will say, like, it's not necessarily a very profitable business to be in unless you are an owner operator. And then it makes your deals a lot more profitable. And the reality is that most property managers aren't accountable to a whole host of investors who want a whole host of very specific data points of information. And so it's just simply not of value to the property manager to communicate in such a way that would satisfy for us the requirements of an investor, which are very reasonable. We understand that we're operating people's retirement, their savings. They have aging parents, they have kids in university. Like, this is important. This is hard-earned money. And so I think for us, wanting to be able to provide the kind of information that causes investors to feel at ease, that they can trust us, that we're not trying to hide anything. But when we talk about the transition from property management to vertical integration, it becomes clearer and clearer, at least to me, and I think to our whole team, why getting that information has been so challenging, and why sometimes it can feel to an investor of like, man, why aren't they providing this? Well, the answer is like, we're trying. It sometimes is much more of a challenge to get to the information in the time frame when you're going through a third party. So I think in the end, this is going to be a game changer for us. I think it will be a competitive advantage as we enter into new markets. I think it will set us apart. I think actually we'll be known in some of those areas as owner operators. And I think that current owners of deals that we would like to get into would see what we're doing and would be drawn to that. I mean, even on the acquisition side. So I think there's a benefit all around.
I agree. Major benefit in so many directions, even that we've not even seen yet, I know. But what we have seen and what we've heard from other operators, and that, like you mentioned, getting the information for our investors is difficult, right? Especially from third party management, often, not always, but I think too, I'll highlight that when we hired asset manager, right? As we've grown, obviously Sam and I couldn't keep doing asset management and still look for deals and still talk to investors and provide the care that we need. So we had to bring somebody on, right? It's a natural progression for most syndicators or operators. But as we did that, we started learning more about how the deals were being operated that we didn't know before, I think, right? We started figuring, oh, wait a minute, we can do that better, or this should be done that way. We know this. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, we have to do something with that knowledge now, right? So, eventually it's like, okay, to make this happen, pass a bunch of details there, but we had to bring it in-house, right, to make it happen. And so we did. And Deana's hammered that home there. I was like, so eventually, hey, we can provide the necessary information that investors want. That's what we had to do. And we do believe it's going to be a competitive advantage. Our acquisitions team, they've already talked about it. Sam has mentioned as he's traveled to a few different markets recently, as he shares that, he can tell that it makes a big difference, with brokers and sellers. And, it makes a difference that, hey, these guys are serious, right? It's just another level, in the business. And so appreciate your thoughts on that, Deana. What about any other questions that you could share with us right now that investors that are maybe more common right now that we could discuss?
Yeah, I think they want to know when the next deal is coming down the pipe. And to which I never have a really good answer, except that I can see now, as we pivot into new markets, that there's going to be new opportunity. So I think for me, I see my job not only as I'm reporting to investors like information that they want, but I'm also trying to educate investors. I mean, we have some very sophisticated investors who are very experienced, deep financial background, but I'm always educating on what the front lines are going, what's happening on the front lines of our work. So what happens when we get to a new market? What makes us choose a new market? Are we just chasing where tech and population growth is, or do we also want to see some anchors like military presence, healthcare presence, university of 15,000 plus tech money coming in? Like, these are all criteria that we look at when we look at what would make a great new market to begin investing in. Also, I think as we diversify, we want to be in markets where we don't want to avoid hot markets just because the lines are so long. But I think that as we grow, we don't want to put all of our weight down in just the success in a new market where there is so much other competition. So we want to be in the game, but we also want to be looking creatively at where do the metrics line up for profitability in new places.
Yeah. You talked about, obviously educating investors, and even, every phone call, hopefully you're educating that individual, you're answering these questions. But you mentioned this earlier, and I wanted to point it out to listeners, whether you're a passive investor of ours or soon to be, or you're an active investor, either one. I love how Deana takes these questions though, and like she said, posts them back to the team and say, hey, this is a common thing that investors are having a question about, or here's something we need to address in the next investor update, or here's something people are not understanding, investors are not understanding. And so that has helped us, I think, in a big way. And I think it's only going to continue to help us. And so hopefully you're doing that as an active investor, your investor relations person, whoever that is, or as a passive investor, we need to know, hey, we're hearing these things and it doesn't happen overnight, right? To make these changes or to gather the information, especially as we have taken over management. There's so much data that we have to get input, put in the right places so we can pull all that together for you. We are putting major strides in improving that, just so you know. But my whole point is right now is, hey, Deana brings those things back to the team so we can improve as a whole. And I just think it's so crucial, that level of communication, within, and we're improving that as well as we speak on all levels. And that's just one of many ways that communication has improved, and it's going to help our investors.
Yeah, one other example that comes to mind, I was talking to an investor, I think it was just a couple of days ago, and he said, so when you say you have 94% occupancy on a property, what does that mean? He said, what does that mean for my distributions? Are we on target? What does that mean? So I think for me, it says like, man, what if we were to create a glossary of terms, and link it to our updates where it talks about what does break-even occupancy mean? And what does that mean for where we're at now? How do we talk about where we hope to be? So it's informative for how we, curate information and present it. We want to be right in the tension of not too much, but quality, meaty information. And then if we have investors who are particularly hungry for more, then we're always happy to, provide more information.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We never want to talk down to investors, right? But however, we do want to educate those and not talk over the top of people who are just getting started investing in this space either. So we're getting low on time. So I want to allow you to be able to help the listeners with something else, though, because it's something that you are an expert in, and that's building relationships. And maybe you can speak to a method or a way that we're doing that lately, or diving into on the events part, and share, how do you do that so well? How do you build those relationships so well?
I think listening is really important. Just getting to know somebody, asking questions. As I mentioned, even getting into this business and into this industry, it was all through active listening. And I mean, I'm really curious. I'm really interested. So I'm not just asking questions just to pass the time. I'm actively taking notes. I actively wanting to connect dots. And I think one thing that I bring to the table that's unique is that I am a connector at my soul. So even if it has nothing to do with my job, but I'm like, oh, there's a ding, ding, I sense that maybe you should be connected with this other person. Generally, I will always offer to make the connection. Now, what someone does with it is totally up to them, but it's really fun to see your worlds colliding. So I see that a lot with investors. And one way I will continue to do that is to ask our current investors if they have people in their circles who they think could benefit from investing with LifeBridge Capital, could benefit from learning more about apartment syndication. And so I've been starting to launch a happy hour campaign, starting to host some just very informal gatherings at local spots where investors can come, and then also they can bring their friends, or we can onboard new folks who want to learn more about us. It's very much about networking and meeting. I mean, I personally believe that our community of investors in and of itself is an asset. I think that if they continue to network with one another, I mean, my goodness, what is in the room? Your sphere of services are set. So we're going to be doing that, some more kind of happy hour type events where it's more casual, but then we want to also just appreciate our investors. So as we have capacity and as we are planning these events out, we're just going to be hosting some small gatherings for our investors just to say thank you. And we appreciate your trust in us, and we want to continue building relationship. We want to continue knowing where you're going on vacation. We want to know what's driving you. And I think for me, one of the questions I love to ask is really about legacy. So we're accumulating wealth. That's great. But I always like to ask the question, not that it's always my business and not that anyone ever has to answer, but what is it unto? What is your vision for leaving a legacy? It's easy for us to think about our kids or even our grandkids. But how many of us think about 100 generations from now? And what do we have the power to do while we're alive now that could possibly affect that many generations down? So I like to challenge people with those kinds of questions and to go a little bit deeper than where you went on vacation. I start there, but then we move in.
Yeah. Good questions are key. right?
Yeah.
And listening. I think you're really good at listening. And you've mentioned that people like to hear themselves talk, right? And so do we, right? But you got to be willing to be quiet and listen. And that helps build relationships in a big way. What about maybe you could speak to briefly on organizing an event like that? Or I know there's people listening who are on the active side as well that may want to do something like that. Maybe just a couple tips around a successful happy hour for investors.
Sure. I think, a good CRM is important, or just your understanding of the locality of where your like concentration of your investors are. So, I mean, I live in Colorado, so that's where I've kind of begun this project and then just building out. So we keep multiple lists of, people who have not yet had the opportunity to invest with us, but who we've established with as an investor who say, I want to be on your deals list. I want to learn about what you're doing and stay up to date. We want to keep those people engaged. So those people are going to get invited to the happy hour. They're going to be, invited to invite other people. And so I just generally send an email out. And a lot of these people I've been in touch with, my goal is to continually get to know our investors. I'm still getting to know people because I've just joined the team in May, but it gives me a chance then to follow up and say, hey, by the way, I'm hosting a happy hour event. Would love for you to come. And so it's creating energy around an event. It's creating buzz around an event. And so I think one of my personal mantras is like, you can't always expect there to be the party or to be a party. Like you have to be the party. You have to be a place where people want to be around. And maybe you didn't know you were made for investor relations, but if you carry the party, that might be a good position for you. So I think just, momentum is key. So the invitation, I build a website for these happy hours, very simple, so people can go on and register. They can tell me if they're an existing investor, and they can tell me if they're referred by a friend. And then that way I can follow up. For me, follow-up is very important. I'm probably not going to have the chance to give a formal presentation at these happy hour events, but for me to meet people, make connection, and then to really follow up with them and plug them in as they're interested.
Follow up is crucial, right? Follow up is so important. And so, well, all right, Deana, no, that's incredible. I know whether the listeners passive or active, they've definitely learned from you already. But I want to ask a few questions. It's going to be interesting to hear this from you, obviously, since you're part of the team, but that I typically ask of other operators, or other team members in other businesses. But what's our best source for new investors right now?
I think just going to the website and going to the new investors link, basically, I get an email that says you're interested. And then my job is to follow up and connect with you. And then we make an appointment to talk, have a brief 20-minute call, find out who each other is. And that's the best way to initially get involved. You can also email me, just Deana, DEANA at lifebridgecapital.com. Love to hear from you.
I'm going to ask you a few more questions before we end, okay? What's the most important metric that you track right now?
The most important metric that I track right now is just getting through. So we have a big, long list of active investors. And for me, it's getting through that list. I have different cycles of time for different types of investors, but getting through that list to make sure that I've heard everybody's voice, that I know everyone needs. And then if there's any information that they are not receiving that they want, that I can follow up. So the metric of how many of those investors I'm calling within a certain time period, to me, really helps me keep a heartbeat on where our investors are at.
For sure. What about a daily habit or habits that you have that you're disciplined about that have produced the highest return for you?
Yeah. So for the most part, I get up early. I have a lot of children, not a lot. I've got a few kids. So I try to get up before them and just get some quiet time, get in the word. Right now, I'm reading a great book by a guy named Bob Sorge. It's called The Secrets of the Secret Place. And it just talks about creating a secret place before everybody gets up, being in the word, in the Bible, and just kind of getting focused and centered before the day hits the ground running. Keeps my priorities and my significance and my value and my vision all in the right place.
What about the number one thing that's contributed to your success?
Obedience. I just do what Jesus tells me to do.
That's right.
It's obedience, but it's restraint. I think I would add restraint. There's a great power at the confluence of boldness and restraint.
And how do you like to give back?
So I mentioned before that I built a nonprofit, co-founded a nonprofit in Washington State. I've continued to be very involved with the anti-trafficking movement and will probably continue to be so in the future.
Deana, grateful again to have been able to interview you. It's exciting to have team members like this. You, besides Sam, you may be the first one that I've actually had on the show like this. We should do it more often. But I think it's helpful to passive investors and active that are listening that want to hear what other investors are asking, right? And they're wanting to grow their investor base, or else, hey, they just want to know why we brought third-party management in-house. It's going to be helpful to them for sure. How can they get in touch with you to ask more questions, maybe about LifeBridge or our deals, or just to get to meet you?
Yeah. Well, number one, you could find me at the lifebridgecapital.com website. You could email me. Again, email address is Deana, Deana, 1N, at lifebridgecapital.com. And yeah, I would love to follow up with you. Please reach out.
Thank you for being with us again today. I hope you have liked and subscribed to the show. Please tell your friends about the Real Estate Syndication Show. And I hope that you are learning and growing. Don't forget to go to lifebridgecapital.com where you can start investing today.